Good day, everyone, and welcome to this webinar on understanding climate change, loss and damage, and links to humanitarian action, which is the 7th session of the learning stream on climate change and humanitarian action organized by ICFA and PHAP. My name is Manisha Thomas. I'm with PHAP, and it is my pleasure today to introduce my co-facilitator, Nishani from ICFA. Nishani, I'm going to hand over to you for a hello, please.
Hi, Manisha. Thanks. And good morning, afternoon, evening. Welcome, everyone. Amazing to see so many people from all over the world. We've got a huge range of NGOs, UN agencies, governments, everyone here. So and academics, so not to mention, looking forward to the discussion. This is our 7th session. So I would like to reflect a little bit on our last webinar, the road to COP27. Why should humanitarian NGOs engage, where we discussed the importance of this year's Conference of Parties, COP, and how humanitarian actors need to engage by bringing in their expertise and perspectives to the discussion. While we touched upon loss and damage during the webinar, all but minutely, if we're truly and meaningfully to engage and advocate on this issue, we need to better understand and unpack what loss and damage is. What are the linkages to humanitarian action? How is climate change and its impacts altering the nature of humanitarian crises, and how response needs to change, and how especially our response perhaps needs to change to deal with the resulting loss and damage. So climate change impacts arise through a combination of both anthropogenic, human-caused climate change and natural climate changes. The scientific consensus is that human-caused climate change increases the frequency and the severity of climate-related events overall, and can also be compound effects of natural climate variabilities, for example, such as the El Nino cycle. These factors are leading to more and more destructive climate impacts, increased humanitarian needs, and greater losses and damage. The recent Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC reports, have clearly set out that loss and damage is happening now, that it will continue to escalate with every fraction of a degree of heating, and that it comes at an enormous cost to humans, the planet, and financially as well, economic loss as well. So why should we be interested as humanitarian actors in loss and damage? We as humanitarian actors are increasingly responding to extreme weather events such as cyclones, flash floods, and slow onset events such as droughts, which are causing losses and damage to people, infrastructure, and to the natural environment as well. In addition to responding to these events, we're also working in conflict, insecure, and complex emergency contexts. And the vulnerabilities faced in these contexts are even more acute and compounded by impacts of climate change. To give you a rough idea of numbers, perhaps, in 2020, of the 15 countries most vulnerable and least ready to adapt to climate change, 12 countries had a humanitarian response plan. 12 countries received funding from the Central Emergency Response Fund, the CERF. All of them were in a state of conflict or high institutional or social fragility. And to top it off, had concurrent public health emergencies, of course, due to COVID-19. So in today's webinar, Understanding Loss and Damage and Links to Humanitarian Action, our speakers will provide a better understanding of what are the intersections between humanitarian action and loss and damage, and how it's impacting the communities we work with in the most vulnerable contexts. How is it impacting our work? And what can we as humanitarian actors bring to the table? And what can we do better to also support these communities? So we've got a great array of speakers joining us today from global, regional, and local contexts. A special thanks goes out to the group of organizations, especially Oxfam, Mexico, and development initiatives who are part of the loss and damage collaboration focused on humanitarian action and climate, for supporting us on this webinar. And without further ado, over to you, Manisha, to introduce our speakers.
Thanks very much, Nishani. And I think that's a great sort of introduction of why it's so important for us to be considering loss and damage as well in terms of the impact on climate change. And to help us better understand loss and damage and how it impacts humanitarian action, We're joined by 4 speakers today. We have Bettina Kohle, who is Senior Learning Specialist with the Red Cross and Red Crescent Climate Center. Welcome, Bettina. We have Jeffrey Maganya, who is the Regional Head of Programs for the Horn, East and Central Africa for Oxfam International. Welcome, Jeffrey. We have Kriti Shrestha, who is Program and Advocacy Advisors with Zurich Flood Resilience Alliance. Welcome, Kriti. And last but not least, we have Matthias Soderberg, who is Chief Advisor at Dan Churchaid. Welcome, Matthias. And as already mentioned before, we are really hoping today that you're going to share your questions, your comments, and your examples in the chat and the Q&A, but also through the Mentimeter. So let's take a quick look at what we have in terms of the results of the first Mentimeter in terms of those different statements. And as we can see there, I have to make my screen a bit bigger to actually see it. About 44, a lot of you, I don't know if that's 42% actually, 4.2 out of 5, generally, your work is focusing on humanitarian action. So we have lots of humanitarians in the audience today. About midway, we've got your work focusing on climate action. A little bit more of you are combining your work on humanitarian action and climate action. And we're kind of below, towards the disagree level of having a good understanding of the concept of loss and damage in climate change. So I think that really shows the importance of today's webinar in understanding better what loss and damage means and how that impacts climate change. So before I move on to our presentations, we're going to open up our second Mentimeter, and Vaughn has put the link in the chat so that you can go there directly. And this one, we're going to go with a word cloud. So just give us a word or up to 3 about what can humanitarian actors bring to the discussions on loss and damage. And we will take a look at those results later on. With that, it is my pleasure to pass over to Matthias, who is going to be speaking to us about the links between climate change loss and damage and humanitarian action. So Matthias, over to you, please.
Thank you, and thank you for setting up this important event. I've been following climate change for a number of years, but I'm working in an organization where we're also having a big focus on humanitarian action. So I think I am at least quite aware of these linkages, and I'm really happy to share my experiences here. Firstly, as already mentioned, climate change is really a challenge for us all, and it leads to a lot of disasters and situations where there is a humanitarian need. In the climate debate, we're looking a lot on the climate science and to see what we can expect, because as you know, global warming is increasing, and that will increase the effects of climate change. The latest report from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, made it clear that there are limits to adaptation, meaning that we cannot adapt to all the effects of climate change. There are soft limits, which could be handled if we scaled up funding for adaptation and disaster risk related activities. But there are also hard limits where there are no real solutions, and apart from addressing the situations loss and damage create. There are already a lot of debate about loss and damage in the political sphere, and this is also why we are here, because the upcoming climate summit, COP27, will also have loss and damage on the agenda. In the political debate, we're talking about avert, minimize, and address loss and damage, and these are different aspects of the loss and damage debate. This is also relevant for all the humanitarians, because many of these activities also relate to what humanitarian actors already are engaging in. But when we look more into the loss and damage discussion, we would differ between the sudden and the slow onset disasters. Sudden or rapid disasters, that's what we know in many parts of the humanitarian world, where we address cyclones and flooding and natural disasters while the slow onset are maybe not always getting the same attention. It's like sea level rise and changes in temperatures and droughts, for example. We're also different between economic and non-economic effects when we talk about loss and damage. And economic effects we know very well, but the non-economic also needs attention. And this is where we, for example, see the loss of culture or loss of historical sites, loss of biodiversity, and loss of lives. And finally, in the loss and damage debate, we should remember that it refers both to loss and damage. Damage could, of course, be we can recover after a damage, or we can rebuild. But when we talk about loss, it's a bigger challenge, because this is where we maybe have to resettle or restart in a different way. The loss. The focus on loss is difficult to handle, because we haven't really faced the big losses yet in the world. But we know climate science tells us that we may see big losses in the future, both of countries and regions. And this is also part of the loss and damage debate. So what can we learn from each other? Because I think this is at least the entry point for me, how we from the humanitarian sector and from the climate sector can learn from each other, and what are the benefits of working together. So when we look on loss and damage from a humanitarian perspective, I would, for example, bring up impartiality. This is one of the important principles of the humanitarian approach, and meaning that everyone should, those most in need should get the attention and the support they need. Why is this important for the loss and damage debate? Well, there are examples from previous funding mechanisms, like the Green Climate Fund, where there's been discussions about the climate relevance, and for a person affected by a cyclone, for example, it doesn't really matter if the cyclone is related to climate change or if it was just an ordinary cyclone. And this is, I think, an important principle when we talk about future loss and damage finance and mechanisms, that we also acknowledge that for the people who are affected, we should not start fighting about the links to global warming or climate change, because if there is a humanitarian need, that's the main issue to address. Another area where humanitarian actors have a lot of experience, that's the rapid response. And this is also one of the things where I think it's important to learn from existing humanitarian experiences, how to engage rapidly when the need is there's need for action. So there are important lessons. And of course, there are also a lot of best practice on the ground. A lot of humanitarian actors have been addressing natural disasters and also climate-related loss and damage. And in that way, there are experiences which should be brought forward. A concrete example from the humanitarian work we are doing in Danshard Shade is using cash, delivery of cash to people, which has many good effects. And this, when we start to talk about how to address loss and damage, we should remember that there are good experiences and best practices. So from the climate perspective then, what can we learn and bring into the debate also within the humanitarian communities? Well, the justice perspective. While the humanitarian perspective is in many cases more neutral and not taking side, the climate debate is full of discussions about justice. We have clear science telling us that climate change is created by our way of living, and therefore there is also a question of responsibility. The climate justice perspective is important in when we talk about both funding streams and governance and projects. And I think there are important lessons to be learned. And I don't think it's necessarily impossible to also address this in a humanitarian setting. As an example, one way of addressing justice is that people affected on the ground have a chance to influence and to be part of decision making, that it's an inclusive process. And this is also already addressed through the localization focus of the humanitarian debate. Also, as already mentioned, the links to science. I think it's really important. The climate debate has a clear link to science, and there are new research all the time, and we need to ensure that our actions are related to science, so that so for example, if we build a seawall, it must be high enough because the sea level is rising. So there are many things we need to consider in relation to science. And finally, the broad focus of the climate debate is also relevant for the humanitarian communities, because when we address climate change, it's not just about sudden onset disasters, it's also the slow onset, the non-economic loss. It's about rebuilding and resettling and creating a more long-term resilience. So it's going beyond the ordinary focus within a humanitarian intervention. So, way forward, what's happening now then? Well, firstly, I really hope that we can stand together, because the challenges we are facing, they are big. So we need all the humanitarians, and we need all the climate experts and climate activists, and we need to work together. And one of the things where I hope we can also at least make a joint call, that's when we talk about finance. There is need for more humanitarian funds, but there's also need for funds to address climate-induced loss and damage, which cannot be addressed through the existing instruments. And this is also important to consider which instruments are relevant. Maybe some of the existing humanitarian instruments can be used, but maybe they have to be adjusted so that they also fit into the loss and damage debate, or the loss and damage need. But there will most likely also be areas of loss and damage which cannot be addressed with the existing instruments, and then we need to look on possibilities to create those instruments which are lacking. And finally, we should never forget that the issue at stake here, it's the people, and we should not leave anyone behind. And no matter if we call it humanitarian action or loss and damage action, that's not the important thing. The important thing is that there are people on the ground needing assistance, and they should not be left behind. And that's our responsibility as actors, both within climate change and within humanitarian aid. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Matthias. Quite a lot of food for thought, and we've got quite a few questions coming in. Manisha, do you want to go into the Menti before we head to questions to Matthias, or?
No, let's do the questions, then we'll come back.
All right.
Later.
So we've got a few questions coming in on the Q&A, and we've got Catherine asking, what's the main difference between loss and damage actions and climate adaptation actions? Shall we not advocate for more coherent adaptation actions, including the conflict affected areas, is one. And another one that we saw was interesting is, what defines large loss and damage? Where is the place of continuous eroding capacity by the small, recurrent, and continuous extreme events? Let's start with those two, and then we will go to a few others, perhaps. Over.
Thank you, and really good questions, because very highly relevant right now. When it comes to adaptation and loss and damage, this is a political sensitive issue. Right now, there are many of the activities which I would call loss and damage, which are already counted as adaptation by donor countries. So in that way, there is no clear distinction in practice. However, adaptation is in general a way to help people and communities to adapt to make sure that they can live with the effects of climate change. So this is a more preparatory approach where we make sure that we have drought-resistant crops, that we have systems to ensure that we can handle the flood when it's coming. This is the preparation we can do to ensure that we will continue to live even though the temperature is increasing. While loss and damage is referring more to the fact that we will lose and we will face loss and damage if the adaptation was not enough, or if the effects of climate change are so radical and big that we cannot handle them through adaptation measures. So in that way, the loss and damage category is more about accepting that there are situations where climate change lead to a loss and damage we would not like to happen, but it's there, and then we need to react. And that's also relating to the other points about the big loss. There are coming big losses. We know that. And when I say big loss, I mean islands disappearing. I mean coastlines eroding. I mean desertification where pastoralists, for example, can no longer live with their animals because the drought will be endless. Or when the heat, the temperature will increase so much so that you can't really live in an area, and you will have to find another place to live and work. This will have huge impact on our livelihoods, and therefore it's also something I would call a big loss. I hope that answered.
Manisha, do you want to continue?
Yep. Yes, thank you. And thanks for that, Matthias. I think that was really helpful. I had a question I was going to ask you, which I've now, there it is. So we had a question for you saying that you had mentioned responses are hinged on science-based knowledge. And the question is, don't you see that doesn't this seem to potentially ignore the focus on local or traditional knowledge of those who might be behind who must be at the center of decisions? And that risks leaving them behind if we have this focus only on science-based knowledge. How do we bring in those other elements of local and traditional knowledge?
Thank you. Also very good point, because we always need to remember that people on the ground are the experts when it comes to their own lives. And we need to both acknowledge and use and make sure that the local knowledge and expertise is used when we develop the interventions where we address loss and damage. When I talk about the science, it's more on what we can expect, what we can expect will come. We know that science tells us about upcoming droughts and changes in temperatures, tipping points which may have huge impact on big areas. Science can also tell us about changes in the possibilities for agriculture, so that we know that in an area it will not be possible to have a certain crop in the future. We will have to adapt and have adaptation measures to ensure that we can start with other ways of producing food. And of course, when we're making the changes on the ground, the local knowledge and expertise must be in play. But I'm really happy that there are scientists also monitoring the weather systems and the climate on a global level.
Super. Thanks so much, Matthias. I'm going to move next to Jeffrey, because I know Jeffrey's got to leave us in about half an hour, and there's lots of questions that we want to get him to answer before he has to leave. So Jeffrey, I'm going to turn to you, please, for an example on loss and damage from the Horn of Africa, please.
By saying that climate change discussions tend to be very academic, and many times we don't have faces to see. And a lot of time we frame the discussion as if it's a future issue. But the truth is that in the Horn of Africa, it's actually a present issue that's happening now. And many times, like what's happening in the Horn of Africa, when harm does happen, we don't necessarily ascribe it to the cause. And we deal with the loss that's happening as if it's an act of God, something that we have absolutely no control over. In the Horn of Africa now, there is a food crisis. And 2.8 million people are in severe need of food, needing urgent food assistance, and 300,000 facing famine. And this has come on the back of other issues that are also happening. So there is the COVID pandemic that all of us know. The area has also had certain conflicts. There was a desert locust that also affected anything that was green. And we are facing right now what would only be considered as stagflation. So you have stagnation in economic growth, but also inflation going up, and governments just don't have any fiscal space to respond. And this is expanding. It's not getting any better. It's expanding to South Sudan, and it's expanding to Uganda. Originally, we're talking about Somalia, Kenya, and Ethiopia only. And there are faces behind this. They're children, they're older people, they're people with disabilities, they're women, and we're dealing with these extreme weather events. And 2.8 million is a large number. It could easily be a child that you know. And that's really where it hits home. Because I think that if it's statistics, we really don't think of it as something that is worth a lot of thinking. And talking to an example is if you haven't had rain, the water's become really bad. I mean, they become puddles of muddy water. And talking to this woman from Somalia, she says, we get water from boreholes, and it's very salty. So it's contaminated water. It's undrinkable. Nevertheless, we have no alternative. So this is a woman who probably has children and is put in a situation like this. And another one says, the water smells bad. So some households may have energy to burn it. And you can imagine, as it gets drier, fuel wood gets further and further. And people have to walk much further in order to get fuel, even to boil water. So they use a borehole and essentially use the water that they have because they have absolutely no choice. How have we traditionally responded? So there's a continuum of response. There is one extreme humanitarian response and another extreme developmental response. And all of them do have their place. And right in the middle, there's resilience and peace building. So in the humanitarian response, we're very good at this, and we develop mechanisms of dealing with it. So governments declare national emergency and trigger some national. INGOs do appeals and attempt to get money in order to respond to this. I think the problem is that the presumption that humanitarian emergencies are going to be short-term is really disappearing, and it's getting longer and longer. Now, resilience building to respond to this is something also that we do. We don't do it too well. We're very good at humanitarian response and development, and the sector is divided almost psychologically into two. People who deal with development have certain skill sets and are able to respond to developmental issues, use national budgets and use international loans in order to respond. And people who use who work on humanitarian work have appeals and emergency monies. So I think from a developmental point of view, there are countries that have drought, like northern Kenya, Somalia, and Ethiopia, but because they're fairly well developed, their income has increased, they really don't have, this does not affect them very much. So definitely development is one of the tools that we have to consider. And I believe that climate change is a human rights issue, justice and human rights issue. And it's time that we started framing it and identifying people who do have a duty to respond from a developmental point of view, so that you have maximum available resources thrown towards this issue. So I have some last thoughts. And just to say the loss and damage does have a face. It's the women, it's the children, it's the people with disabilities, it's the older people who are most vulnerable to climate change. There is an issue of marginalization. When poverty or extreme weather hits, there are people who are more marginalized than others, and we have to keep that in mind. Secondly, extreme weather is becoming more normal. And the chronic humanitarian issues, humanitarian demands is really the new norm. And we have to rethink how an emergency becomes normal and how we respond to that. And I give it, I propose that as we do humanitarian work, resilience and development thinking has to be linked to it, and also peace building, because we know the part of the issue that's happened in this region is you've had national internal conflicts, people with guns, and also lower level conflicts where people are conflicting because of natural resources that are dwindling. There are governments apparently that are doing very well. So the Kenyan government in northern Kenya has a program called Hunger Safety Net Program. The Hunger Safety Net Program actually has an anticipatory resilience building aspect in the cash transfer. So the cash transfer delivers 100,000 money to 100,000 people, long-term social protection. But if using satellites, they can see that the ground is deteriorating so much, then they trigger an additional resources and monies to reach 300,000 people. And I think that's a very good thing. The Productive Safety Net Program in Ethiopia is also designed to have anticipatory action. And in Somalia, the shock responsive social safety net program for capital development is also designed with that in mind. So I think that the designs are there, but sometimes they lack money, and therefore they're not able to respond in an anticipatory manner. Now, I believe that climate change loss is becoming the more urgent human rights issue in our time. And therefore, there is settled law around this. So human rights principles are settled law. And the principle of participation is something that is not a good programming demand. It's actually a right the poor and marginalized people have. And therefore, in engaging with climate change, we must ensure the participation of poor and marginalized people. The principle of non-discrimination, that's an important principle. It's also settled international law. And whatever we're doing, we can't let children, older people, women, people with disability be discriminated against systematically. And then the other two principles, the principles of transparency and accountability. Whatever we do as humanitarian workers, whatever agency we have to be transparent, and we have to be accountable, particularly to poor and marginalized people who are being hit much more by the climate loss and damage disaster. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Jeffrey. I mean, there's quite a lot of reflections there on the intersections, or the nexus, if you could call it that, on a different level of humanitarian development, peace building, and you mentioned resilience. And this is something that we as humanitarians are not always great at doing. Of course, we have different, I think, models that in some regions there's better models of resilience building incorporated into humanitarian action because of the long-term nature we've been being in, and varieties that we see. And this is something we can learn from. And as you mentioned, this is something we need to see better, as well as the intersections and how do you build that in. Before we go into a little bit on that, we have a few questions for you. And I know time is short because you need to leave. And there's a lot of questions on climate justice, because you and Matthias both mentioned on it. One of the questions is, any thoughts about how human rights can contribute to the current legal model for reparation and compensation for losses and damages associated with climate change? That's one. And then climate justice has been limited by the lack of a causal link between specific climate change effect and specific damages or losses. Thus, the framework guidelines to determine who the compensation parameters for loss and damage, especially what does it mean in the low and middle income countries? Who does that reparation? Is there this, the next steps to it? Over for the moment. There's more to come.
Okay, so I mean, I think the discussion around climate change has tended to be a technical discussion, and if you look at the international treaties that deal with climate change, a lot of them tend to be very technical. UNFCCC and desertification. The more human-facing treaties, the treaties, global treaties on social and economic rights, and global treaties on civil and political rights, are really where some part of these discussions need to be shifting. And I think that the UN has had a resolution on the right to development. The right to development is then an international duty. And I think that so long as we phrase compensation and reparations in terms of the willingness to give, so the person who's willing to give gives, then we're going to be stuck in this rut that we're stuck in for a long time, where we have this 100 billion ceiling that we can't go over. We have to start phrasing these as rights, because rights do have enforcement mechanisms, and even if it's just embarrassment and mentioning of names, so be it. Right now, they are not phrased as rights; they're phrased as charity. And that then becomes a problem. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Jeffrey. That's a lot to think on. Would you also be able to say how do we calculate loss and damage experienced by individuals, communities, and government, and how do we relate this dynamic to changing market price due to global changes? Would you have some thoughts on this?
I think so. So I believe that if we're to think from a rights point of view, what tends to happen is it tends to be, a lot of it tends to be available resource based, and I think that governments at a local level should be able to define budgets and needs of people to deal with the problems that they're facing. Now, there is a principle in social and economic rights around maximum available resources, and that tends to be played at a local level. But I think that it has to be that governments take a lead and NGOs take a lead at defining the needs, bearing in mind the resources that may be available globally. Right now, we know there could be a lot of resources that's available, and deal with people, particularly the people who are at the bottom, the minimum, the people who are so poor and so needy, like the 2.8 million people, all of them would need a certain amount of money in order that they get out of that. And that is almost a civil and political problem as opposed to a social and economic problem. So in short, I think that it's an area that's opening up in terms of calculations. But if governments can use whatever methods they use to define needs, then there should be international financing to support that need.
Thanks very much, Jeffrey. And I think there's lots of great questions for you. So I'm going to ask you a few more since you have to leave, and then we'll come back since you won't be here at the end for the Q&A. I did just want to point out also that Matthias is very kindly answering some of the questions in the Q&A. So if we're not answering your question live, please do look under the answered column in the Q&A, or I guess tab in the Q&A, so that you can see some of those answers. And I do encourage our other panelists to join Matthias in answering some of those questions, because there are lots of great questions coming in. So thank you all for that. But Jeffrey, I've got a few questions for you. You know, considering the cycles of drought is speeding up and is proving to happen more often in the Horn of Africa and spreading, what can we do to work with governments to urgently prioritize climate change? And maybe linked to that also, this concern that's been raised, sometimes it becomes a bit protracted or cyclical problem that just keeps going on, and at a time it goes silent, and then it only becomes topical when a disaster strikes. So again, we're sort of waiting too long until we're really taking the action that's needed. So in that sense, what can we do to work with governments in those kind of situations, so we don't wait till it's gone so far, but that we can make sure that we're really pushing some of those development and resilience actors to step up earlier?
I think the word is to turn the discussion into a developmental issue, so that we don't discuss it as a humanitarian response issue. Of course, we'll deal with humanitarian response when people are in a crisis. However, we have structures within governments that deal with development, and as long as the planning horizon of governments do not take on these issues as developmental issues that require longer term planning, then we will not do much. So the answer is using whatever system there is. So some countries are more democratic than others, but even the countries that may not be more democratic, participation again of people who are affected by this issue, so that they're able to define what sort of longer term answers they want, is actually the principle that we use in whatever circumstance that we have. If we go to the people who, as you say, who are the wearers of the shoes, and they know where the shoe pinches, then they're more likely with their leaders, local leaders, to define how they think they can get out of the issues that they're suffering from. And I think that part of the challenge is there's a whole infrastructure that's developed around humanitarian support, and that's not necessarily a problem. But I think that there should be a link between humanitarian work into resilience building and graduating more into development, and all these should work within local governance structures as much as we can. So we do what we can, but fit them within local governance structures. So governments who are primary duty bearers then start seeing climate change and loss and damage caused by climate change as part of their primary responsibility, and therefore ability to get international funding to deal with it.
I mean, Jeffrey, I think that's a really good point about how do we turn it into a development issue. I think one of the challenges, and that's another question that had come up, if you're in a protracted crisis, like in Syria, for example, or Afghanistan, for example, that access to development funding or development processes becomes much more challenging. You see that very much, if you don't have the government structures in place, donors that do development funding, or even some of the banks, are less likely to give that money there. So that's when humanitarians are often stepping in and really dealing with all these issues. So how do we solve that problem? I think it's not a new one necessarily, but I think it's becoming much starker in climate change as things are changing much more, as we're seeing these more extreme weather events, more droughts, more floods. It's the humanitarians that step up. How do we shift that sort of thinking, and maybe even the timelines and processes for development actors and development donors?
I think that the buzzword of Nexus really has then to be activated, that these things don't happen in series. We should not be dealing with humanitarian work, then we deal with development, then we deal with peace building or governance or state building. I think that all of them should be done concurrently, and the energies that we put in humanitarian work, we have to open another small window in which we're talking about peace building, and even if it's small p, peace building, but also state building. Because some of the places that you talked about, it's really states that are collapsing. And if we can work on state building, then it allows for more developmental financing to come. So in a word, we have buzzwords about Nexus, but Nexus is hopefully separated. It's hopelessly separated. Development people talking about development, humanitarian people talk about humanitarian, peace building people talk about peace building. This has to really come together.
Super. Thank you very much, Jeffrey. Nishani, do you have another question for Jeffrey, or shall we move on to the Menti poll results?
Let's move on to the Menti poll results, and we shall continue. Thanks so much, Jeffrey. And it was really insightful, and we hope you could stay longer, but I'm sure we come back to you to respond to some of those questions in writing, perhaps, and share that with the participants later.
So I'll stay on for the next 10 minutes and then, then I will leave. Thank you very much. And thank you very much. And I apologize for having to leave.
Thank you, Jeffrey. There are still some questions in the Q&A for you. So if you've got in that last 10 minutes, please do type some answers in for us.
I'll do that,
yeah. Most appreciated. But turning now to the Menti poll, let me just pull that up. 1 second. Here we have, I've got to make my little screen bigger. 1 second. So here we go. We had, what is it that humanitarian actors can do to bring, what can humanitarian actors bring to the discussions on loss and damage? So we've got lots of things around experience, prevention, anticipatory action, response, advocacy. And I think some of those elements there are, ones that we see happening in the humanitarian field that we really need to be also maybe perhaps pushing a little bit to get that nexus activated, as you said, Jeffrey, there, but also, financial contributions, response capacity, accountability. My screen is not big enough for my little eye.
Technical expertise.
Thank you.
Evidence. Yeah, evidence is something that we keep getting asked for. So, and we're in contexts where it is hard for others to provide evidence. So maybe this is something we need to do better.
Thank you, Marcus.
Thank you, Marcus. Yes.
We've also got some data on damage, historical knowledge, early warning systems. And I think those early warning systems could be particularly helpful in terms of really pushing some of those resilience and development actors to come in there. Community awareness, community-based strategy. So I think really that experience that humanitarians have of really putting people at the center and making sure that we're not leaving anyone behind, that link to the development actor of the development goals there. I think we've got that experience of really putting individuals, regardless of age, gender, or diversity, at the center of our responses, linking science to local, the Nexus we've got some experience on as well, accountability, logistics, resilience, field expertise. I mean, there's lots and lots of things, as you can see from that word cloud, and people are still adding to it. So I think there's a lot that humanitarians can definitely bring to the loss and damage discussions and conversations. And I think it's really figuring out how do we sort of harness that expertise to bring to those conversations and debates. I'm going to just launch us into the next Mentimeter before we turn to our next speaker. And here we're again going to ask you up to 3, what are the challenges you're facing or expecting when engaging on the topic of loss and damage as a humanitarian actor? So really, what are the things that you're facing as humanitarian actors? So we will leave that up there, and Vaughn's kindly put the link again into the chat for you to be able to respond directly to that. And while you do that, we're going to turn over to Kriti, who is going to talk to us about the perspective from the Zurich Flood Resilience Alliance. Kriti, please.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Manisha. Namaste and good evening to all. Zurich Flood Resilience Alliance, through partners Practical Action, Mercy Corps, and IFRC, we work with flood-prone communities in southern Nepal to help them find practical ways to strengthen their resilience to flood risks. We have this vision that we do not want floods to have any kind of negative impact when it comes to people's and their businesses' ability to thrive. Can we move on to next slide, please? Thank you so much. So like I said, this is a multi-sectoral partnership where we focus on finding practical ways to help communities. And we believe in the power of resilience. We believe that if we act early, if we invest on communities' resilience, we will be able to save the costs post-disasters. So that is our guiding star, that is our vision. So moving on to the presentation, next slide, please. So in 2019, we conducted, through ZFRA, we conducted a study on loss and damage assessment in Nepal, which was the first of its kind in Nepal. So during that study, we focused on the 2014 flood events that washed away and damaged many districts and communities in southern Nepal. So this particular flood event caused widespread devastation in terms of rendering hundreds of families homeless, jeopardizing their livelihoods, and adversely impacting on significant social sectors. All this combines, the flood caused huge economic and non-economic losses in Lower Karnali River Basin. Now, in one of the districts of Lower Karnali River Basin, the Bardia district alone, 12 lives were lost, while 13 went missing. The district recorded extensive damages in terms of infrastructure, in terms of agricultural land, suspension bridges, electricity, drinking water, hospitals, livestock losses, and other infrastructures. A total of 3.17 billion Nepali rupees of economic loss was reported. Can we move on to next slide, please? Now, the government has these extensive databases on economic losses, and they have these post-event, after every big event, they go to the field and collect all these databases. But then these databases totally miss the non-economic losses and damages that these communities face. Now, when I was making this slide, I was very much tempted to leave this slide empty, because this is the amount of information that we have when it comes to non-economic loss and damage. This is not seen in numbers. This does not come up in reports. So this is we do not have much information on non-economic losses and damage. While we were doing this study in Karnali River Basin, we talked with people, and then they also had similar kind of feedbacks. Many of the community members, they recalled in horror of how the floods swept away their large swaths of agricultural land. And you would imagine that, the community's problems would only begin once the flood happens, because it would damage their agricultural land. It would render them unproductive because of the large amount of sedimentation deposited there. It would cause it also resulted in a lot of pest attacks the following year, post floods. That also happened and affected their agricultural productivity. And many of the marginalized smallholder farmers were forced to relocate to other areas to change their livelihoods, because what they had in terms of small amount of land, small kathas of land, were rendered useless. So these are the kind of studies that you hear when you go to the field. And apart from that, when I was talking with our community member, one particular lady recalled that she was 12 when the 2014 flood happened. And during that flood, she was actually preparing for her exams, for her annual examinations. But the floods completely inundated her house, her assets, and also her school notes. Her mother was so traumatized that she was not able to go back to school after the floods for a month. Many of her classmates had to leave schooling behind and were forced to work, to earn, so that they could recover from the flood losses. She was one of the few lucky ones who could finish her school, but the trauma of floods, even if it rains in the midnight, she's still traumatized. So that kind of trauma the communities report back to this state after 2014, so many years later. And this just gets repeated after each massive flood. For example, during last year, in October, there was this unseasonal floods when the community were about to harvest their paddy. Unseasonal flood happened and inundated their ready to be harvested crops in their fields. So that also traumatized the community members a lot, because the rain came out of nowhere. And one particular lady from Nangapur, she was sharing with me that when the rains happened in October during the festive season of Dasai, she was torn between whether she should run home to save her assets and her family members, or whether she should move to the fields and save what she could from the paddy that was about to be harvested. So that was the dilemma that these communities have been facing, and that is how they are expressing their trauma. Another lady, while we were doing this focus group discussions, one of the lady also shared that many organizations and agencies come to their communities, come to their villages and ask them and provide them with relief materials and help them to recover, to build their house, to build the physical infrastructures. But no one asks them how they are doing, how they are mentally dealing with this kind of losses. No one goes to the displaced communities and asks them, are they easily settling in to the new communities? How are they feeling? We cannot even fathom their trauma, their their ability, their sadness of leaving their social structures, of leaving their social networks, of leaving their close friends behind and moving to a new place. Now, the communities that we work with in Bardia and Kailali, they are most predominantly Tharu communities. These Tharu communities have a very unique social structure called Badghar system. So all the decisions, all the sharings are done by these Badghar systems. But when the community gets displaced and they are forced to relocate to another community, it takes them a while to get used to the whole Badghar systems. And it may cause a lot of conflicts in terms of resources allocation, resources sharing, and also to assimilate into this new Badghar system. So these are the challenges that the communities have been facing post the extreme events. And these are not calculated in terms of loss and damages. So similar are the cases of the Bangaon and Fata communities that have been displaced from previous floods and resettled in different areas. They are still finding it difficult to assimilate to the new areas. And they have their lands that have been rendered useless in another community, but they are forced to relocate to this new community and find new ways of livelihood options. You know, some are forced to fishing, some are forced to move to other cities and earn as daily wage laborers. So that is the story many of the community members have in these flood-prone communities. Can we move on to next slide, please? So my next slide is about the Nepal's assessment framework on climate-induced loss and damage. So in October 2021, Nepal came up with an assessment framework to address and assess climate-induced loss and damage. So it is a start. It heavily draws from all the humanitarian, the data collection methods and all, as well as climate change adaptation and vulnerability analysis. So it is basically, the tool is a marriage between the humanitarian tools and the tools used in climate change adaptation. So that kind of thing. So this is a start, but since it is very, very theoretical and heavily draws on a lot of literature, it is still to be tested, and there has to be a lot of work to be done in terms of non-economic loss and damages. It does mention economic loss and damages clearly, and to a certain extent touches upon the non-economic loss and damages, but does not come up with a comprehensive assessment mechanism for non-economic losses and damages. But this is a start, like I said, this is a start for a country like Nepal to prioritize, and shows how much priority our country has been giving for loss and damages. But like I said again, because loss and damage is not extensively a climate change issue or extensively a disaster issue, it has to be owned by the different agencies that work on two different sectors, bring their forces together, and then support the communities who are facing this at the forefront. So that is something that we need to do, and we should work jointly, because another thing is that when we talk about loss and damage, we tend to focus on extreme events like floods. For example, all the examples that I have given now are of floods because it is easy to show. But there are also slow onset events that will affect the community. In Nepal, recently we're having this monsoon, but then there have been breaks in between monsoon. So one of the communities in Bake, they have declared their areas drought region. This is very new, less than a month, but then these could be the manifested impacts of slow onset events. And these could lead to loss and damages in a longer term. This could be the loss and damages that these communities are facing without labeling it so. So these are the things that we need to be aware of, anticipate, and then work forward to. Can we move on to next slide, please? So this is my next slide. So whatever we talk about here, whatever we say, whatever we hear, it boils down to three key asks. The first is that we need to have improved capacity to understand loss and damages, both extreme events, both slow onset disasters, but also not only at the top level, but also at the community level, the municipality level, the local government level, the ward level. They need to understand that this is loss and damages. These are loss and damages, and these need to be assessed. And these would be the mechanism to take it forward. The second would be to try and reduce and avert the risks associated with loss and damages. This could be from climate change adaptation. This could be from effective DRR policies. And the third would be, and the most important would be having enough finance. Whichever sources it comes from, it needs to be there, properly used, and reach the community members. So those would be the three key asks from my end. Thank you so much. Over to you, Nishani.
Thanks so much, Kriti. Lots of food for thought, and we're getting quite a few questions also on not only the Nepal context, but also in general about community understanding and loss and damage. So one of this is, to what extent is communities' local socio-cultural aspects relevant to understanding of the losses and damages? And you spoke about this is something that we don't, the non-economic loss and damages are not taken into account. So, and we've been asked, so how do you measure this non-economic loss and damages? How do we take this into account when we, and is that possible as humanitarian actors? I mean, we talk about psychosocial support to communities who are traumatized after, events, as refugees, as IDPs, we support them. Is this part of this kind of package that maybe the loss and damage community can learn from us, is one? And then how can we make this understanding useful to local communities themselves, including public authorities? And how does that help, has that helped in the Nepal context? Also, one of the other questions that we have is how much of the impacted communities were involved in the preparation of Nepal's loss and damage framework? So how do we get communities themselves to be part of these processes, these mechanisms, and engage them when we are using mechanisms to support and provide reparations for them? Over.
Thank you so much, Nishani. So I'll start with the last question. How many community members were consulted during this process? Sadly, not a lot. Maybe a lot of experts were consulted from both humanitarian sector and also from climate change sector. A lot of stakeholders were consulted, but many communities were not consulted. And like I said, this still needs to be tried and tested. So it is extremely theoretical. So it just has been taken up from a lot of international and national case studies, so a lot of studies. It still needs to be tested, but it does have an extensive examples as case studies of the flood and landslide events that have occurred. So basically all the economic loss and damages data again, but not the community perspective, not how community sees this kind of thing. So that is one response to it, and which should be prioritized, which should be consulted as we go into the process of testing this. So maybe while we go on testing this, we will have more community engagement and feedbacks that can be fed into the improving the loss and damage assessment framework. The second would be the role of public authorities. The Nepal assessment framework highlights that the ultimate responsibility would lie in the municipal and rural municipalities. That is the lowest level of governance. And after that, there are ward levels, but then that is the second lowest level of governance. So the framework does highlight the role of public authorities, the local governments, the municipalities in this framework, the key role, but then it also highlights the lack of capacity and resources at these levels. So while acknowledging the role is of paramount, it also highlights that there is a lack of capacity and lack of resources to take this forward. So I am sorry, I missed your first question, which was on non-economic loss and damages, something I kind of didn't hear it properly.
Yeah, so the socio-cultural aspects, and what is relevant, what are the parameters that are relevant when we're looking at non-economic loss and damages?
So when we're looking at non-economic loss and damages, something that Recollection did in our studies was we looked at various cultural and societal identity. For example, loss of dignity could be one. Similarly, ritual and practices that have been lost while the community has been displaced from one area to another, that could be another. Similarly, loss of, to a certain extent, for example, biodiversity losses, loss of ecosystem services, that could be another parameter that it has to be looked at when it comes to non-economic losses and damages. So these are some of the examples. I can share the detailed assessment framework in the chat somewhere, and then also happy to respond to questions offline if need be, send the documents if need be. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Kriti. I have a couple of more questions for you, if I may, before we turn to our last speaker, and then we do have time at the end, I believe, for Q&A still. So there's, because we have a lot of questions. I think we probably have more questions in this webinar than we've had previously, which I think really speaks to the fact that there's lots of questions around what does what is loss and damage and the link to humanitarian action. There's a few questions around, who pays for climate-related loss and damage? I think it's a pretty big one, especially when you're looking both at the economic and the non-economic loss and costs. How do we really figure that out? Is there a system being looked at? Is it the polluters? Is it governments? Is it donors? And the question was around, in poor countries, where will they find the money to pay for these loss and damages we're talking about? And, whose responsibility is it to pay for climate change? And then maybe an easier one as well is, is there a kind of agreed upon system for assessing loss and damage? You said that the Nepal system was done looking at a lot of the humanitarian data collection and systems there. But is there sort of a more globally agreed way to assess loss and damage? So one hard one and one easy one, easy-ish one.
Sure. I will try to answer, but I'm also looking at Matthias because the who pays question, he would be more relevant to answer. But I mean, that is the whole debate of the whole UNFCCC and the climate justice, isn't it? Why should a community member who has 1 katta of land living alongside riverbank, who does not have other livelihood resources, pay for the sudden, climate-induced floods that they have no contribution to? Why should, isn't that the whole idea of climate justice? The whole UNFCCC is based that the developed countries should provide technology, finance, and resources to the developing countries so that they can adapt, they can mitigate, adapt, and address loss and damage issues that have been caused due to climate change. So I'm just saying this much here, putting the questions back and asking Matthias to help me answer this. The second question on assessment, it is still new. The whole loss and damage, the WIM, it is still developing, evolving. So what we have here is what Nepal has proposed is one of the best practices that has boiled from all the good literature that has been there. But there is no one way to do this. There's no one way to do this. And I think it is still evolving, and we're still looking forward to the best methodology, the best framework that could be there. But then we could have bits and pieces of the best practices from other countries and also see which one would fit our country, our context, and our structures, governance structures and all. So I think I would leave to that. Over to you.
Thanks very much, Kriti. Nishadi, did you have any other questions for Kriti? I feel like maybe we should go to Bettina and then we'll come back to that big question, give you some time to think about it, Matthias. But maybe we hear first from Bettina and then we can start getting into that really big, tough question and sort of where we go next, if that works. Great, thank you very much, Kriti, for that. And then I'm going to move over to you, Bettina, who is with the Red Cross and Red Crescent Climate Center. So Bettina, you're going to give us a bit of a humanitarian perspective on loss and damage, I believe, please. Thanks.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. And I'm really glad to see so many engaging questions and such diversity of participants in this webinar, because I think these kind of discussions are exactly the discussions we need to have to move us forward. So let me share a little bit the call to action and how can we, what is important, what I'll ask for COP27 to put this into a slightly bigger perspective. And the cartoons that you see in this presentation are actually from engagement processes around the topic that we had in the last 2 years, where we invited cartoon artists to listen and to share their impressions of our discussions. So this one here is particularly significant, I thought, and that's why I wanted to start with it. It feels like for a very long time, we have spoken in the climate sort of discourse around, is climate change happening at the very beginning? Then is it actually anthropogenic climate change? Then is it really real for a long time, for quite a few COPs? And we had various IPCC assessment reports. And I think we are finally all on the same page that we are in a climate emergency. And you can see, I hope you can read it, such a bummer, time is up, is unfortunately that it is very late and that the window of opportunity that we have to take action is very small. And when you think I'm talking about decades, no, I'm talking about years, not decades. So this is something I'm going to talk about a little later. And let's see if I can move the slides myself. Oh, yes, it's working. So the IPCC report, the assessment report, there are 3 reports released recently, is very, very sobering and very tough reading, actually. But it says quite unequivocally that the climate crisis is a humanitarian crisis, and that it has already disrupted the lives of billions. So this is not a future thing that we are bracing ourselves for. This is something that is already happening right now and already affecting communities as we speak. And I think the stating the obvious, but this report very clearly provides evidence to say climate change is not a standalone event that is affecting communities, but of course, if we have marginalized communities and groups, they feel the impact much worse. And I think we heard that very clearly also from our previous speakers. And unfortunately, one thing that we need to brace ourselves for is that the consequences for humanity will get worse, a lot worse, and a lot sooner than we thought. And I think this is something that really should ring all our alarm bells, because it really says, what we're experiencing now is not the status quo that we have to deal with. What we're experiencing right now is going to get a lot worse, a lot sooner than we think. And we need to anticipate this. And I think earlier someone was saying, do we need science? Do we need to not take action? And I want to say, yeah, the science aspect is really, really crucial to understand what is it that we're more or less expecting. So what is it that we're preparing for, because we're not having a stable situation at the moment. And then, as I said earlier, the window of opportunity is closing very quickly. We probably have about 10 years in an optimistic scenario to really turn things around on the mitigation side. So on the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions, so as to avoid a much accelerated change. And this is something very, very hard to achieve. So does it feel a bit like this? And I'm not sure if you can see the caption. We should get off then. I thought we agreed on that an hour ago. Let's go over our options one more time. And I really hope this is something that we're not going to discuss and conclude at COP27, because our options are very few already, and we don't have the luxury of time. So maybe this cartoon is a little pessimistic, but cartoon artists say this is what they feel when they listen to our conversations. And I think we have a lot to learn from their insights. So what can we do about this? And I think the first one is that we really need to shift perceptions. We need to say this climate crisis is also a humanitarian crisis, and urgent action is needed now. I think for long enough, we have been in silos, and we have spoken, the climate activists have spoken to other climate activists. And I think we need to widen this discussion and widen this dialogue. And this is why I'm really so glad to see such a diverse audience here, because this is really a planetary dialogue that we need to have, because it is about our future. We need to change the narrative and really say we need locally led climate action, and we need to very clearly prioritize the most vulnerable. And those are the most vulnerable groups right now, but also the most vulnerable groups of future events that we are anticipating, quite importantly, to anticipate this. We heard already the crucial role of finance, and we need to make sure that we have more finance for adaptation, specific finance for loss and damage, that it is actually going to the most vulnerable, and that they're, quite importantly, able to access it, and access it at the local level by local actors. I think Jeffrey was saying, yeah, sometimes it's really, really hard to access funding, especially when governance issues are there, especially when there's maybe conflict, and accessing funding is very, very challenging. So this is something we really need to push for and improve. We also need to improve and scale up action that we're taking on the local level. We talked quite a lot about this earlier, so I won't dwell on this too much, but it's really, really important to include different types of knowledges here so that the solutions that we come up with are innovative, practical, and effective. And I think someone said earlier, the locals are their experts of their own development and their own adaptation measures. And I think we need to embrace this and understand that we're dealing with complexity and diversity, and that we do justice to exactly that. And hopefully, like this, we actually shape the impact that we're having from the humanitarian sector and reduce the impacts of the climate crisis. And here's another cartoon, very interesting, on climate finance. You see huge wildfires and thunderstorms raging towards the person who's sitting on piles of paper, which is also money that'll burn, saying ultimately you'll have to spend it, but if you spend it now, it'll do more good. And I think this is something really critical to say. If we finance action right now, we can actually prevent a lot of the impact, or at least we can buffer it. But if we wait and discuss, the impact that we'll have to deal with is much more harder to manage, and it'll cause a lot more human suffering. And so to conclude, what are the key asks for COP27? Firstly, I think we need to be very clear that we need to increase the focus on the urgency of action to address the humanitarian impacts of the climate crisis. We're already struggling to manage today's humanitarian impacts of the climate crisis, and if we do not manage to curb emissions, this will accelerate, and the impacts that we'll have to deal with will be more severe. And the IPCC made it very clear that we're not on a good course to achieving effective mitigation goals. And so therefore, this is a really a very urgent issue to address. We need to prioritize, secondly, the needs of most vulnerable in climate action. We need to understand that most vulnerable groups, people, countries, and communities, also in fragile, conflict and crisis affected countries, need specific attention and need support. And those affected by the current food and security crisis, for example, in various parts in Africa, and those who have been displaced from their homes by climate-driven events, need to be taken into consideration when we talk about prioritizing action. We talk quite a lot about finance and the importance to increase the amount of and accessibility of climate finance, to have dedicated finance to loss and damage, and to make sure that is actually accessible by local communities to take action. We need to scale up effective climate action so we can really adjust to new realities, think about what we need to adjust to when we think about future extreme events that we're dealing with, and also future impacts of slow onset events that I think are becoming more and more pressing in some areas, especially on sea level rise, on desertification, on glacial melt. And I think last but not least, we really need to be very strong at promoting locally led action on adaptation. We need to make sure we implement projects and action on the ground that are locally led. And we need to strengthen these local systems so that climate risk information that we have can really be integrated in the local decision-making processes. And with this, I want to end and say, we are dealing with a very complex situation, as you see. The COP processes are very complex, they're very technical. The community contexts are very complex and very specific. And we don't have the luxury of time. So with all of this, I really want to say, we need to count on all of us to really think about creative ways in how to take action. And there are very many people on this webinar. If we all go and take action, that is already quite a good start. And hopefully it'll be creative. And I'll leave it as here and see if there are any questions. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Bettina. Some advice on what next steps and how we could go about this as humanitarian actors. And we've got some questions, obviously, and one of them is always on the financing aspect. And one of the questions we've been asking is how should humanitarian organizations position themselves to access loss and damage finance mechanisms? And one of my questions is this something we should be doing, or is it something that we should be cautious about? Because from what I've been hearing, and I might be wrong because I'm new to this topic too, is that the loss and damage finance mechanisms or the whole processes are very cumbersome. And this is the other thing that prevents governments even from accessing them, because there's a lot of process behind it. It takes a lot of time. And even some of the NGOs that may have access to it said it took them at least 3 to 4 years to even put in a proposal. So that is one question. How do we position ourselves? Is there easy access to this? Is this something we should be, looking at, or is there other methods of access to financing that needs to be more on the humanitarian side that we should be thinking about? That's one big question. And I'm sure Matthias has some thoughts on this too. The other one is how actively should humanitarian organizations be lobbying to demand better climate policies from governments? Is this something that is part of our role? And if so, what should we be doing as advocacy towards governments, and what should be something of our key asks from them on it? I think I'll leave these big two for the moment and come back to you with 2 more that I have as well that I think would be interesting for others to hear.
Thank you. So let me tackle first the finance question. I think it's really important to say that what we have at the moment is adaptation finance. And that is quite importantly to distinguish from loss and damage finance that there is asked for. So adaptation finance is there to help communities to adapt. And of course, I think as Jeffrey pointed out, it sometimes is a bit of a gray area. When do we talk about adaptation? When do we talk about loss and damage? But at this point, we don't have a dedicated finance mechanism for loss and damage. This is something that is being pushed for very hard, especially by the least developed countries. And this is something that I think we'll hear a lot more about as we're approaching COP27. The adaptation finance that is available at the moment is indeed, and this has been raised quite a number of times in the ministerial dialogues also that we've been involved, by the countries saying we struggle to access the climate finance because often the barrier of entry is very high. For example, your finance systems need to be quite elaborate. There need to be a series of sort of auditory requirements that needs to have been met. And many vulnerable countries are struggling to get accredited to access this climate finance. And so this is certainly something that needs to be addressed. And this is something, one of the big challenges, I think, for us is to really see how we can ensure good access from governments and from countries to adaptation finance, because it is so crucial. And secondly, I think what is on the cards to discuss is how can we structure a loss and damage finance mechanism, and how can we make sure that this is functioning quite fast? Because I think there is also a sense of urgency that this finance mechanism must really be in place very soon. And I think it's not decided yet if this should be a separate finance mechanism or if it should use existing structures, maybe in a slightly changed format. That was the finance question. Just remind me of the second question again. I got so carried away on the finance question.
Sorry, I need to unmute myself. Yes, yeah. And the other one is, oh my gosh, now I've also lost track. Oops. Oh yes, how active should humanitarian organizations be lobbying to demand for better climate policies from governments? What should that key ask from humanitarians be? Should we be in that space? Because we always get, oh, we shouldn't be lobbying, we shouldn't be activists, etc.
So I think we can really engage on so many levels, and I think it depends on the organization and your mandate and where you feel like you can make the most impact. I think certainly the one element that is really, really effective is to link to the sort of whole NAP, the National Adaptation Plan process in country, to really see how we can support with data, with insights, with maybe support and other practical engagement around strengthening the NAP processes and their implementation. That is certainly something on the national level that is a really important step to undertake. And then I think also we need, as I think we heard in Priti's discussion presentation, we need to also bring the stories from the field onto the global stage, so people really understand in the negotiation space that this is not a technical discussion. This is a discussion that is about real people and lives that are already impacted right now.
Absolutely, it's bringing it back to those most vulnerable communities, right? And this is what we're always trying to talk about. And especially, I think in the humanitarian sector, we've been getting quite a few questions on, how are we accepting climate refugees? How are we discussing this topic? What about disaster displacement? Is this part of the conversation when it comes to loss and damage? Those are also questions to ask. But I have one more to follow up on the finance one, because I think there's a lot of interest in this topic on this call as well. Is one of them is, can you speak to the interaction and separations between humanitarian channels of funding and action, the HRPs, etc., versus the disaster risk reduction national action plans versus climate adaptations, as well as the opportunities and dangers of working at these intersections? I think coming from a humanitarian perspective, what should we be worried about, or should we be wary about some things?
Sounds like the persons asking those questions have great insights to share too by the question. I would say, of course, for the local communities that many of us work with, this is not really a differentiation people would make. They say, oh, this field was impacted by, was it a DRR event, or was it actually adaptation, or is it a slow or fast onset? No, I think it's really up to us as humanitarian agencies to navigate this complexity as good as we can in order to support local communities as best as we can. And I think this is really where us as humanitarian agencies, we need to kind of negotiate, on the one side, the technical complexities in accessing those funding streams in order to really support locally led development in an integrated way. And that is really no small challenge, because I think if we have these parallel strands on community level, it will lead to a really loss of synergy, but also potentially to confusion. And I really think we need to make sure we maximize the impact and the finance. And this is really the challenge, I think, that is on our shoulders. So yeah, it actually needs a lot of technical insights on all of these strands, and to really see how we can also help the system to be more synergetic, because I think we need those synergies if we want to move forward. May I say, with the exception that we also need to be very clear that finance isn't counted in multiple strands, so that countries will actually claim that they have supported funds for development and DRR and climate action, and in fact, this is the same funding that is being put forward.
Thanks very much for that, Bettina. There's a couple of questions, I guess, to really build on that point you'd made about how we need to bring those local kind of stories to the global level to make it much more understood in those big debates between countries that are going on. And one of them was, how do we integrate this climate change loss and damage debate into our local cultural conversations? And then what are your thoughts on how we then bring those local problems and challenges to those UN kind of climate negotiations when they are speaking in very different languages and rather complex sort of terms sometimes that may not be easily understandable for lay people like me or anyone else who doesn't know all that kind of technical stuff, especially when you get into the difference between adaptation finance or loss and damage finance. What are some of the kind of strategies or tools that we can really use to really get local communities to have these conversations and then translate those to the global level?
So, yeah, I think one aspect, of course, is really to link with your local, your national negotiators and the negotiating team, and to make really sure that they are aware of what is happening on community level in their country. That is not always a given. And I think something that really needs time to grow. So it's good to do that not just before COP, when everyone is getting more and more frantic, but to start really quite as early as possible and build the relationship, have those conversations, and maybe even ideally have someone from a community as part of a government delegation to go to a COP. Maybe, may I say, COPs they're very complex and they're very technical and they can be very frustrating. So I think then it's really important that someone makes sure that this is a good learning experience also for someone from a local community going, and it's not just traumatic. I think we had a couple of years ago, we had a local farmer from South Africa giving a presentation at an official side event at the COP, and there was a negotiator there, and she gave it in her native language with translation, showing photos of what action she's taking to adapt to climate change. And there was a negotiator who said, this might be the only thing I remember from this COP, this person standing there talking about her life. And I really think sometimes these stories are too polished and too much focusing on the political sort of asks of the respective organizations who are hosting them. And I really think we need stories that speak to the negotiators and the decision makers at COP that are also people and that we can speak to as humans, transcending some of the technical barriers. It's not our task really to transcend the technical barriers with these community stories. I think it's our task to bring the humanity into the technical discussion. But that is my personal opinion, may I say.
No, I think those are some really great suggestions, Bettina, and I think it is that. And I think it'll be interesting to see at this COP, I think with more those kind of industrialized countries seeing more of the impacts on climate change, is that going to change their approach at COP27? Is it going to maybe be the game changer that we need to make those changes those mitigation changes that, those other changes we need to be doing in that very short time window, as you said, Bettina? But thank you so much, Bettina. I'm going to turn to the results of the Menti poll and then come back to you, all our panelists, for some of the bigger, tougher questions. So I hope our panelists have a chance to go through the Q&A so that you can prepare yourselves. And we also had that big question that we're going to bring back to you, Matthias, about who pays. But taking a look at that Menti poll around, what are some of the, now I forget what the question was. Sorry, what challenges are you facing or expecting when engaging on the topic of loss and damage as humanitarian actors? So funding seems to be the biggest one, but also coordination, responsibility, time, capacity, communication comes up. A few funding issues are coming up a lot there, but we're also seeing kind of organizational culture not understanding it, donors failing to see the linkage, preparedness fatigue, food security issues, a lack of accountability, lack of adaptation, lack of willingness, a traditional mindset, short-term project cycles. I think that's one we've heard of a lot in the humanitarian sector, not only on climate-related elements, but also when it comes to protracted situations. We've got a limited understanding as a challenge, but also political barriers. Explaining the UNFCCC language and jargon, I think, is another one that makes it quite challenging as well. Flights for international staff, that's an interesting one. I think in our own way as humanitarians, we often will contribute through flying. And I do also wonder how much are we contributing to climate change with all the flights to all the different COPs, but that's another side question. I think compounded crises is also another big challenge. Racism in the world, reconstruction being ignored, and unrealistic timelines. Again, many challenges that we're facing. I won't go through them all, but we will have those available on the website following this session. So lots of challenges that we need to be addressing. And I think that funding one maybe leads us very much back to that question that I'd asked Kriti before. And Matthias, you seem to be the one who may have the answer to that. But who is it that pays for climate-related loss and damages? You know, is it polluters? Is it governments? Is it companies? Who is it? But then I had another question that was, I lost that one. So I'll just stop there. Maybe Matthias, I'll hand over to you, and Bettina, if you want to also come in on that. And then really, we've got a bunch of other questions for you. So Matthias, maybe I hand to you first, please.
Thank you. If I had to answer, then it would be very easy. Personally, I think the polluters should pay. That's the good thing with climate change, that we have a very, very confident group of scientists telling us that the way we are living is leading to emissions, leading to global warming, leading to climate change. So polluters should pay. However, it's not as easy when it comes to UN negotiations, and climate finance has been one of the critical things for as long as I can remember in the climate talks. And it's because the climate talks are not so much about climate as they are about growth and development. All countries want to ensure that they have a chance to grow and develop, and therefore they are looking very concerned about on the flows of funds and how they are both how they are mobilized and how they are spent. And now when it comes to loss and damage finance, there is currently no decision about loss and damage finance. It's actually not even acknowledged as a category. That's one of the critical points in the talks, developing countries calling for loss and damage finance. There is actually one example of loss and damage funding, and that's from Scotland. The government of Scotland have created a fund. That's the first sort of formal loss and damage fund. But I think considering the situation and the urgency, there will be a growing focus on the need for loss and damage finance. And this is why I also want to answer the question about why should humanitarians engage. Because when we start to get loss and damage funding flowing, we need the humanitarian actors to be actively engaged, because when it comes to implementation on the ground, together with local communities, of course, but the expertise which we already have is needed. We should not invent the wheel again. So it's really, really important to have cooperation between climate people and humanitarian people. And just last point on funding, there is of course also a big concern, and this was also raised in the chat. What will happen when there is agreement about loss and damage finance? Will it just be humanitarian funds getting a new label? This is a concern, and this is why we really need to follow this discussion closely, and why we need to ensure that there are new and additional funds available. To make this happen, there must be changes in a number of developed countries, but hopefully also some more kind of innovative ways of mobilizing funding so that polluters are paying. And this is one of the key issues we are at least following, because it's concerning if money are just changing label and then we will not get any action. And then also absolutely last point on the funding thing is that we need funding for also the slow-onset disasters, the non-economic losses, the big losses which you can't really deal with through a project. And this is not humanitarian funds. To be clear, humanitarian funds are not enough and not relevant for many of the loss and damage related challenges. So we need loss and damage finance on top of the humanitarian funds, which we of course also need. Over.
Thanks very much, Matthias. And Nina has pointed out in the chat that also a Belgian province has committed L&D funding in addition to Scotland. And I'm actually sitting in Scotland right now. And I just want to do a shout out for Scotland because they're the first place that has actually mandated providing period products for women free of charge. So I think Scotland's kind of leading the way now. So I'm quite happy to be sitting here right now. But I'm going to pass over to Nishani because we do have a lot of other questions. And thank you again to our panelists who've been answering those questions. You might have to answer a few more because there's like 77 open ones. But Nishani, I'm over to you, please.
Yeah, I think I would like to bring in some of the practical questions that we're also getting from humanitarians that are working on the ground. And I think between the three of you, you can answer in your context and what you've been working on. One is, what are concrete steps to ensure that the initiatives to reduce loss and damages, it's prevention, preparedness, adaptation, mitigation, all these things we keep talking about, disaster risk reduction, are covered and implemented effectively in our humanitarian action plans? I mean, I think this is something key for us as humanitarians who work in our, looking at this in our designing, in our programming, in our actual delivery of action, humanitarians, short term be it, but we are in most countries for long term. We know that and we see that. So how can we make sure that we're looking at this lens in the work we do and are ensuring that we're trying to minimize that impacts of the most vulnerable communities? That's a big question, maybe. The other one is, it's a bit technical, but we'd like to hear about loss and damage in relation to human rights. How can the new UN resolution on the right to a safe and healthy environment support policy and finance solutions to loss and damage? And this is one of the new resolutions that have come about, and I'll share the link with everybody if you have not seen it. That's one. So I think I'll leave the two and I'll come back to another one on gender, which is, that's another champion that we think we need to discuss and unpack as well. Over. Anyone wants to take it? Take the two?
Let me take a first step, maybe. So what are concrete steps to reduce loss and damage? I think there are so many things we can do, and I think really we should probably see what fits our skills, what fits what fits or suits our ambition, and where are we placed well. I think there are many time segments to work with here, and the one is like, what is happening right now? So how can we maybe have on the quite short-term horizon, think about early warning systems, think about short-term anticipatory action, so that we can actually prevent some damage from happening, because some damage will happen already. But to prevent or to reduce human suffering, to reduce loss and damage, this is something that for some areas for some time, that might be a good approach. I think also it is important to at the same time think about the slow onset events and the longer term time horizons. So what we are doing right now in terms of, for example, supporting resilient communities, supporting resilient livelihoods, takes into consideration climate information and projections, so that these communities are not just resilient today and next year, but also in 5, 10, 15 years. Maybe I'll leave it at that for now.
Go ahead, Preeti.
Yes, thank you. If I may add more to Bettina, I think we also need to look at how to make our governance system, our development planning more climate smart and resilient. So the examples that she gave was more at a community level, at making resilient communities, but at the same time, we also need to build the capacity, invest in our government programs, development planning system, and try to make it more climate smart and risk informed, so that it is able to anticipate the impacts of the future climate change impacts, and then be able to function during these when these climate impacts occur. So I think that is also something that we need to keep in mind.
Any reflections, Matthias?
Yeah, I think we also need to remember that climate change and climate-induced loss and damage will lead to displacement, and this is really one of the tricky things, because a lot of people will have to move and to find new ways to live somewhere else, and this is going to happen within countries, but it's also going to happen cross-border. And we need to consider how to deal with this in both politically, but also in a funding and finance context, because people will have to get new education, new trainings, be able to work with new things, maybe learn new languages. there's so many things which are related to changing the location, and this is something which is most governments are hesitating to start discussing it, but we know it's happening. It's already happening, actually, but it becomes a much bigger problem in the future, and we need to learn how to deal with it.
Absolutely, and I think that there's also the Nexus aspect that Jeffrey brought out earlier, right? And it's that intersection of at different layers of programming, and how do we make sure in governance structures, but also at the UN level, or be it at the country level, when we're looking at development plans, we're also incorporating this. Is it displacement, be it climate displaced induced, disaster displacement that PDD is working on quite a bit? How are we incorporating this into our planning, our programming, our whole country perspectives, taking into aspects of the risk that is going to be faced in the currently we are facing, but also in the future. And is that happening at country level is also my question. I think already that Nexus in practice is something that we need to do. I see Kriti is shaking her head. But yes, and the other thing I think would be interesting to hear is that gender perspective, because or even the other perspective that we keep hearing is, how are we really looking at people with disabilities? Are we taking into consideration all these inclusion, the diversity and inclusion issues into the loss and damage issues? Because at humanitarian level, we're trying better and harder to make sure that this is taken into account. We can do, of course, way better. But is this conversation there also in the loss and damage? And where can we link up as humanitarian actors?
Can I start on that one? Because it's really important to bring this perspective into the loss and damage debate. And I would say it's not a loss and damage debate, it's a climate finance debate. Because it's in general, there are a lot of nice decisions and words about how to work more with inclusion, but they need to be implemented. As an example, all countries should have a gender and climate focal point. So that's a good entry point. Of course, that person should also relate to loss and damage. So there is a need for getting the gender issue and equality issues on the agenda, high on the agenda, so that it's being addressed in all elements of the climate debate.
Thanks. Anyone in, Kriti?
Yes. So I just want to focus on the 9 steps that the Nepal's assessment framework on climate-induced loss and damage has, and how it tries to include the gender issues and the people with disability issues in it. So I think amongst the 9 steps that our country has identified, the second step that focuses on understanding the indicators, identifying the indicators in terms of exposure and vulnerability. That could be one areas where we could explicitly look at it. And then the 8th step, I think, the 8th step would be assessment of avoided risk through adaptation and the other options, and also identifying other drivers. So those could be 3 potential steps where we could look at all these intersectionality and inclusion issues. So yeah, that would be from the assessment framework that we have.
Thanks. And Bettina, any last thoughts?
Maybe just briefly, I think when we talk about locally led adaptation, and also the way we as humanitarian organizations are engaging in this work, are engaging in the process, are employing staff, I think it's really, really important to include gender and diversity in those processes as well, also our own processes, and to really interrogate when we engage, who do we engage with? Is it really the most vulnerable, or is it the most accessible? Is it the ones who are hardest to reach, or is it the ones who actually are able to communicate effectively via email? And I think those are really some hard questions we can ask ourselves. It's not very comfortable. I also want to include one of the comments in the chat that I saw. Yeah, how about our travel? What is our mitigation strategy actually to reduce our carbon? And I think those are really important questions to have internally within our organizations to say, in the pandemic, we could work virtually. And I think a lot of people say, yeah, maybe we can continue hybrid events, think about new ways of doing things. And maybe I want to say, concluding, is really that this is also an opportunity for us to really think about better ways of doing things. This is a good pivotal point where we can actually put creative ideas forward on financing, on how we feel things need to be done, that have a really good chance of being embraced. I think there's a bit of a search for how we can move forward, and the situation is a little stuck. So I think maybe also really a call to say, please engage. This is something where we need new ideas and really some hard-hitting, maybe revolutionary new ways of thinking and doing things.
Thanks very much, Bettina. And I think that's a good sort of call for us moving forward, really. I think all of you, and including Jeffrey, unfortunately he had to leave earlier, have really highlighted some of the complexity around loss and damage. And I think that point that oftentimes it's measured on an economic level, but that non-economic side is so critical as well. So how do we as humanitarians, who often will see those impacts, and we've been really seeing some of those non-economic impacts when we're talking much more about inclusion, how we've often missed people who are not easily accessible. How do we ensure that any trauma that's there, survivors of gender-based violence who may be more affected through climate change or who may be re-affected with climate change, and really, how do we make sure that we're putting people at the center? And I think, Bettina, that point about really shifting the way of the language, because as we've seen not only in this webinar, but in the previous ones, a lot of the language around the UNFCCC reports is quite technical, quite complex. And so it's a very different way of being able to engage. So I think really figuring out how do we as humanitarians really make that link from what we're seeing on the ground and working with local communities to really help get them to engage with their negotiators at a national level so that we can really make some of those changes at COP27 has been very clearly made by you. I think that's really a call for all of us today. I think it's been a really helpful conversation. However, I think it's been also, raising a lot more questions. I think there's still so many more questions around the loss and damage that all of you have sort of put out there. How do we make sure that we've got that participation? How do we deal with climate justice? How do we make sure that we get people, including, as you said, Matthias, the polluters, to pay? How do we deal with some of those issues around climate refugees, quote unquote? We don't have a framework for them. What's going to happen as people are forced to move more and more moving ahead? So I think a lot of those questions, we'll probably discuss them in a future webinar, I hope. I think it's really bringing together that in a way, really, that making reality that nexus between what we're seeing as humanitarian actors, what climate activists are doing, how we need to bring in development actors and resilience actors. Although I do recognize someone said sometimes resilience actors don't like to be called resilience actors. But a lot of those local communities that are there is, how do we bring them all together so that we're working at the same time and not doing the same thing we've done for so long in terms of it's a sequenced event. We need to be bringing in actors at different times, yes, but also working continuously, because as we've seen with protracted crises, we need development actors to get in there more. So how do we influence them and governments who give money to be more flexible and less risk averse? Yes, less risk averse. Really getting into places where there are protracted conflicts so that we're able to do that. So huge thanks again to all of our panelists. I think it's been a really interesting conversation and one that we will continue. We will have a recording of the event, both in video and audio, only podcast format. So you can either listen to the whole thing or watch the whole thing again in the coming days. So you'll have access to the presentations as well as the results of the Mentimeters. We do have a short evaluation that we would love you to fill in. My colleague Vaughn has stuck the link into the chat. And it just leaves me very much to say a huge thanks again to all of you who have joined us today with great insights, conversation starters that you've got, lots of really exciting questions, and I think really relevant questions as we're moving towards COP27, but also really thinking about how as humanitarian organizations or those working in the humanitarian field can really start to make those links much better with climate change and the loss and damage. I think there's huge opportunities for us, not only individually within our organizations, but as organizations to see what we're doing to be contributing to that, but also really how do we work with the communities and support them to really bring their stories and their experiences to national negotiators, but also to COP27 so that we're really able to move things forward. Huge thanks to all of our panelists. Thank you again, Bettina, Matthias, Kriti, and I want to say Jonathan. Jeffrey, thank you. Sorry. I think I still have a bit of COVID brain left over from a month ago. I apologize. Huge thanks also to PHAP colleagues and ICFA for co-hosting this, and Nishani as my co-facilitator, and Ellen as our captioner for a really interesting conversation. And we look forward to having you join us again at a future event. Thank you all.
Thanks all. And we'll be discussing and unpacking some of these discussions that we've had on climate financing, on displacement, on a few other topics that have been climate justice that I think as humanitarians need to unpack further. So looking forward to future webinars. Please keep an eye out on those topics. Over.